Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. With the transfer portal largely winding down, you're starting to get a better feel and picture for what these programs and teams are looking like heading into spring practice, fall camp in the 2024 season. And Mike Norvell and Florida State have been about as active as any program in the transfer portal. And I want to take a deep dive into this Florida State offensive line and talk about what we saw from the film in 2023 after watching some games back, looking at the season-long numbers, then talk about what this offensive line is going to look like in 2024, obviously with some additions that I've been very vocal about really liking. Richie Leonard IV, Terrence Ferguson coming in. Really excited to get into this group. Now, next week, we're going to take our deep dive into that Florida State defensive line. Really excited to do so. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys and a special shout out to the Florida State fans. I mean, this has been a program that the last couple of weeks I have had an absolute blast breaking down all of these commitments. The amount of support you guys have shown really does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And more importantly, for these kind of deep dives, I would love to hear from you guys. I learn a ton from you guys. We have phenomenal conversations in the comment section regarding this offensive line. Would love to hear from you guys, whether you agree with my takes, whether you disagree. Would love to learn from you guys, chop it up with you guys in the comment section. And without further ado, I want to start with what we saw from this Florida State team in 2023 on the offensive line. And you got to start with just appreciating the strides that this unit has made over the last couple of years. I mean, a couple of years ago, this was truly a liability for this Florida State team. And I mean, Alex Atkins and this coaching staff have done a phenomenal job with this offensive line over the last couple of years. This was an offensive line that was a Joe Moore Award semifinalist, was considered one of the better units in the country. Now, for the Florida State fans that have been listening for the last couple of months, this was always the position group that I said you want to see take maybe that next step. Because you look at that Florida State team in 2023, I thought it was largely a national championship caliber team, right? Obviously with Jordan Travis and the wide receivers and Trey Benson, the defense was phenomenal all year. The one unit that was probably not, I don't want to say lagging behind, but maybe didn't have that national championship caliber ceiling was that offensive line. And so what does Mike Norvell do? One, you have a lot of guys that are returning in the 2024 year, and Mike Norvell goes out and grabs potentially, I think, 2 starting caliber guys to plug and play on the inside. This is a unit that you feel good about the veteran depth, and you also feel good about the talent that's getting injected to this group. I think you can see some strides in 2024. Now, going back to the 2023 film, I got some of my notes here. I thought this unit struggled at times playing against the elite defensive fronts. So like Clemson or Duke, and when you are Florida State and you want to run kind of those power concepts or those counter concepts as well with pulling offensive linemen, one of the most important aspects that you can have is making sure you're winning the line of scrimmage. Because when you're trying to pull 1 or 2 guys to the play side and they're kind of having to work through some clutter because some of the other offensive linemen aren't necessarily winning at the point of attack and getting driven off their spot, it makes it really hard for that counter concept to work. And at times when you saw them play Duke, I thought this was the most evident against Duke. At times against Clemson, you saw guys trying to pull and get those counter concepts going, and they kind of had to work through a lot of traffic because some of the other Florida State offensive linemen weren't necessarily establishing the line of scrimmage as much as you would like. And I think Mike Norvell saw that on the film, and so he goes out and gets guys like Richie Leonard IV and Terrence Ferguson that provide a lot of juice on the inside to start, kind of winning the line of scrimmage and letting those counter concepts play out a little bit more. And with DJU coming into this Florida State offense, you're going to see a lot of power concepts in this run game heading into that 2024 year. Richie Leonard IV and Terrence Ferguson really excite me in terms of injecting talent into this Florida State offensive line. Talk about a guy like Richie Leonard IV first, a guy that we broke down when he committed, kind of as solid as they come. This is a guy that started all 12 games for the Florida Gators in the SEC in 2023 and was extremely reliable. And I think he fits perfectly. He's 6'2", 310 pounds, so necessarily the weight isn't necessarily massive, but he's only 6'2". And so what does that tell you? He is strong, compact. He plays with low pad level. He's a guy that can move bodies off the line of scrimmage. Now, his length is sometimes a concern in pass pro, but in terms of getting that run game going. He's a good athlete. He can move people off the line of scrimmage. In my mind, I think what you're most excited for Florida State in 2024 is this inside of the offensive line is probably going to get a little bit more movement than it did last year. And a guy like Richie Leonard IV is certainly going to help. And then Terrence Ferguson, kind of a different kind of prospect, right? Richie Leonard, high floor. Like, you know what you're getting with Richie Leonard IV. Hard to see him not being kind of just a plug-and-play guy on the inside of this Florida State offensive line. And then you have a guy in Terrence Ferguson who hasn't necessarily played a ton of football yet during his collegiate career coming over from Alabama, but a guy that has such a high upside. And when you turn on the film, the only game he started was that USF game, a guy that is very athletic, obviously is a massive human at 6'4", 325 pounds, a guy that I don't even think has scratched the surface in terms of what he can do. And a guy that with more opportunity and more reps in practice, I think probably emerges as another starter at that guard position. So you start looking at Richie Leonard IV, Maurice Smith, that center coming back, and Terrence Ferguson maybe battling it out with a guy like Keandre Jones. I look at that inside of the offensive line and say, I think it's going to be a little bit more of a, physical group than you saw with Florida State in 2023. And I thought that was the biggest problem, right? This was a unit that at times struggled to win the line of scrimmage and get much movement. And again, when you're trying to run some of those counter concepts and you're not winning at the line of scrimmage, it gets hard to do so. And I think another thing that I noticed on the film in 2023 before we talk about the tackles was, this was largely a unit that it's hard to evaluate because these guys weren't healthy, right? They were just playing kind of a ragtag, giving a guy a break one week, playing him the next week. And you almost never saw the same starting five from week in, week out basis. And I thought you saw some of that kind of rear its ugly head in terms of giving off stunts and picking up blitzes. The communication and the gelling of this offensive line wasn't as good as you want it to be. And I think what you're excited about is if you can stay healthy in 2024 and have more of a consistent starting five, that gelling and that communication and giving off stunts and picking up pressures probably gets better in 2024. Now, you look at the offensive tackle spot, and I think Florida State's largely in a lot better of a spot than most other Power 5 programs. You look at most Power 5 programs were desperate to try to get starting caliber offensive tackles coming into this program. Mike Norvell didn't take a tackle because I think he feels kind of good with what you have coming back. Darius Washington, Robert Scott, Jeremiah Bowers. And again, a lot of these guys battling injuries. Darius Washington, 278 pass for opportunities, only gave up 11 pressures. And a guy like Robert Scott, who continuing to kind of bang the table for Robert Scott, I think can be a really good offensive tackle. 112 pass for opportunities, only gave up 5 pressures. If they can stay healthy, I think you got 2 really, really quality tackles competing. Then you have a guy in Jeremiah Byers who, as much as we just talked about Florida State not winning the line of scrimmage as much as you would like against that top defensive line talent, Jeremiah Byers did. He's a guy that can move bodies around in the run game. Now, his struggles come more in pass pro, where he gives up over 27 pressures on 400 pass pro opportunities. I think you're in a good spot. You got 3 tackles that you feel kind of good about and giving you some flexibility on what this starting five is going to look like heading into 2024. And the overall goal of a offensive line is getting the best 5 on the unit, getting them out on the field. And you have some flexibility on what that might look like. Kind of hard to predict. Now, there's one guy that I want to mention that is not in this conversation, but I think could emerge to be in this conversation 8 months from now as we're going into the 2024 season, and that is redshirt freshman Lucas Simmons, who was a true freshman last year, redshirt, didn't play much. He's a guy that we knew would take a year, right? He's 6'8", 300 pounds, coming out of high school, super raw, right? He grew up in Europe, didn't play much football as a young pup, and then gets to high school, and you see kind of every physical trait that you want, right? The length, the athleticism, the ability to bend and operate in space. He's checking off a lot of boxes. You just knew that it'd be tough to get him a lot of reps as a freshman because he is still learning the sport. With another year of offseason for Lucas Simmons, continuing not only to get that body right, but to get a little bit more technically proficient at that offensive tackle spot. Not necessarily a guy that I think emerges as a starter maybe in spring camp, But a guy that you get into fall camp and start talking about what this offensive line looks like, I wouldn't be surprised if you start hearing Lucas Simmons as a guy that could be a starter, at least a key contributor for this Florida State offensive line in 2024. So kind of my overarching takes is I think the depth is there and the experience is there. Like, you largely know what you're getting from this Florida State offensive line heading into 2024. I think the two keys are, one, obviously, you want to see this unit be a little bit more healthier throughout the duration of the season. So you hope you see that. And then more importantly, can they take that next step? This was by no means a bad offensive line in 2023. But I do think it was the part of the team that maybe would have held Florida State back. I think you want to see them take that step to be an offensive line where this offense can operate and kind of lean on. And I think they certainly can take that step, right? You inject a lot of talent. You return a lot of starters. If Florida State's offensive line can take that step in 2024, I think that's probably what you're most excited for this Florida State team on the offensive line. Again, a group that has shown a tremendous amount of growth over the last couple of years. You want to see that continue in 2024. Those are kind of my takes on it. Next week, we got a Florida State defensive line preview coming. I cannot wait to get into that. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys again. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate all the support, and we'll talk to y'all later.